The streets of Philadelphia were buried beneath freezing rain the night everything changed. Car headlights reflected across wet sidewalks while exhausted workers hurried home through the cold without looking at the people sleeping beneath bridges and bus stations. And near the entrance of an old convenience store downtown, 68-year-old homeless veteran Frank Doyle sat quietly wrapped in 2 worn blankets, trying desperately to stay warm through another brutal winter night. Most people walked past Frank without even noticing him. To strangers he was simply another homeless old man with tired eyes, an unshaven face, and a cardboard sign asking for help beside a shopping cart filled with everything he still owned in life. Some people avoided eye contact completely. Others tossed spare change near his feet before continuing on with their day. Nobody stopped long enough to ask who he used to be before life broke him apart. But years earlier, Frank Doyle was once Staff Sergeant Frank Doyle of the United States Army. And once upon a time, people called him a hero. Frank had served 2 combat tours during the Vietnam War as a combat medic, carrying wounded soldiers out of gunfire while risking his own life countless times to save others. During one battle near Da Nang, Frank reportedly ran through active enemy fire 3 separate times to rescue injured Marines trapped in the jungle after their evacuation helicopter crashed. Several soldiers survived that night only because Frank refused to leave them behind. But when the war ended, America moved on. And many veterans like Frank returned home carrying invisible wounds nobody around them understood. Nightmares followed him for decades. Loud sounds triggered panic attacks. He struggled holding jobs after losing control of his emotions unexpectedly. His marriage slowly collapsed beneath the weight of untreated trauma. Then alcohol entered his life. Eventually the drinking cost him everything he still had left. By the age of 68, the war hero who once saved lives overseas was sleeping beside convenience stores trying not to freeze to death. And almost nobody knew. That freezing December night, Frank noticed something lying near the curb beside the bus stop while packing his blankets together for the evening. At first he thought it was trash blowing through the street. But when he reached down, he realized it was a leather wallet soaked from rainwater. Inside was nearly $3,000 in cash, credit cards, family photographs, and a driver's license belonging to a businessman named Daniel Morrison from Boston who was visiting Philadelphia for work. Frank stared at the money silently for several seconds. $3,000 could change everything for him. It could buy food, a motel room, warm clothes, medicine, maybe even a chance to escape the streets for a while. For the first time in months, Frank imagined sleeping somewhere warm. Then slowly, he closed the wallet again. The next morning Frank spent almost 3 hours walking across the freezing city searching for the address printed on the license because he had no phone and barely enough energy left to stand. Eventually he reached a downtown hotel where Daniel Morrison was staying during his business trip. When hotel staff first saw Frank entering the lobby soaked from rain carrying a shopping cart behind him, security immediately moved toward him assuming he was there to cause trouble. But before they could remove him, Frank quietly held out the wallet. "I think this belongs to one of your guests," he said softly. Moments later Daniel Morrison rushed downstairs after hotel employees contacted him. The businessman opened the wallet quickly before freezing in complete shock. Everything was still there. Every dollar. Every card. Every photograph. Daniel stared at Frank speechless because earlier that morning he had already accepted the money was gone forever. He immediately tried handing Frank several $100s as a reward. But Frank gently shook his head. "No sir," he whispered. "It wasn't mine to keep." Daniel could barely believe what he was hearing. Here stood a homeless man wearing soaked clothes and broken shoes refusing money most people would have taken without hesitation. Deeply emotional now, Daniel asked Frank a simple question that changed everything. "How did someone like you end up out here alone?" At first Frank hesitated. Then quietly, he told the truth. And by the end of the conversation Daniel Morrison sat there in tears listening to the heartbreaking story of a forgotten war veteran abandoned by the country he once risked his life defending. The story spread online later that evening after Daniel shared a photo of Frank beside the returned wallet on social media. Within hours, millions of Americans saw it. Then something unbelievable happened. Former soldiers recognized Frank's name from Vietnam. One elderly Marine contacted reporters claiming Frank Doyle had once carried him across a battlefield after an explosion nearly severed his leg. Another veteran shared military records confirming Frank received multiple commendations for bravery during combat but quietly disappeared from public life decades earlier. Suddenly America realized the homeless man returning wallets on a rainy sidewalk was actually a forgotten war hero. The country responded immediately. Donations flooded in from strangers across the United States. Veterans organizations offered housing assistance. Doctors volunteered trauma treatment. One retired Army officer personally arranged permanent housing for Frank near a veteran support center in Pennsylvania. But perhaps the most emotional moment happened several weeks later during a small ceremony organized by local veterans. As Frank entered the room using a borrowed suit jacket, dozens of elderly veterans slowly stood and saluted him in complete silence. Some of those men were alive because of him. And for the first time in decades, Frank Doyle finally broke down crying. Not because of the money. Not because people suddenly knew his name. But because after spending years feeling forgotten, somebody finally remembered his sacrifice. And maybe that's the tragedy of so many heroes. Sometimes the world only notices them after they've already suffered alone for far too long. But even after losing everything, Frank Doyle still chose honesty over survival. And perhaps that is what revealed the kind of man he had been all along. Not broken. Not worthless. Just forgotten. Until America finally looked back.